Hello. Today we're going back to 1993 to look at one of the most disturbing and bizarre disappearances in Oregon history. This case never made national headlines, wasn't the subject of any high-profile TV shows, and that may be why it still holds on to its creepy originality. This is the story of the Raymond family from Sacramento. Their camper van was found torn to pieces in the depths of the Syscue National Forest. Nothing remained of the family except for a few scraps of clothing and a diary whose pages describe the horror that grew with each passing hour. This story is not about the supernatural, but about a collision with something completely real, yet utterly alien to our world. It is about how sometimes the wilderness is far wilder than we can imagine. It was supposed to be a dream trip. John Raymond, a 38-year-old civil engineer, had always been a practical man with his feet firmly on the ground. He loved nature, but approached it with caution. Carefully planned routes, high-quality equipment, and double provisions. His wife, Melissa, a 35-year-old school teacher, shared his interests, albeit with less enthusiasm. For her, the most important thing was spending time with her family, John, and their two children, Leo, 10, and Chloe, 7. The idea of spending 3 weeks traveling through the forests of Northern California and Oregon in a rented motorhome was John's. He spent months planning the route, studying old logging road maps and searching for the most secluded and picturesque places that ordinary tourists couldn't reach. The final destination was the Syscue National Forest, a vast, wild expanse on the border between the two states, a place known for its giant cedars, impassable trails, and complete absence of civilization. In early August 1993, they left their cozy home in the suburbs of Sacramento. The first few days of the trip, judging by the photos found later on a miraculously preserved roll of film, were absolutely idyllic. Happy faces, campfires in the evenings, and fishing in mountain rivers. On August 19th, the Raymonds turned off the main highway and headed deep into the forest on an old gravel road known on maps as Fire Road 4109. This road led into the heart of the forest, to an area where no economic activity had taken place for decades. According to John's plan, they were to find a place to camp by the Illinois River, spend a couple of nights there, and then move further north. He had not chosen this place by chance. The maps promised complete seclusion, and that's what they got. The place where they stopped was a small clearing, surrounded by a wall of ancient trees, a few dozen meters from the rushing river. It was a zone of complete radio silence. No radio station could penetrate the thick mountains and forest. Cell phone service didn't exist in such areas in those days. They were utterly alone, cut off from the rest of the world. The last entry in John's diary, dated the evening of August 19th, is full of quiet satisfaction. Found the perfect place, not a soul for miles around. Melissa is a little nervous about the lack of communication, but the kids are thrilled. Tomorrow we'll go fishing. The air is incredible. It was the last peaceful entry in his diary. The first alarming event occurred that same night. At around 2 a.m, as John later recorded, they were awakened by a strange sound. It wasn't a wolf howling or a bear roaring. John had grown up in the countryside and knew the voices of wild animals well. This sound was different. Low and vibrating, it seemed to come from underground and reverberated in his chest. It lasted only a few seconds and then stopped. John got out of the camper with a powerful flashlight but saw nothing. There was complete, ringing silence. He dismissed it as seismic activity or an unusual echo from rocks moving in the river. But Melissa, he said, couldn't sleep until morning. She said she had the feeling they were being watched. The next morning, August 20th, the incident was almost forgotten. It was a sunny day, and the family went fishing. John and Leo were busy catching trout, while Melissa and Chloe picked berries at the edge of the forest. Around noon, John decided to walk upstream in search of a better spot and stumbled upon some tracks. They were on a damp, sandy stretch of shore, partially hidden by grass, and they were unlike anything he had ever seen before. They were the prints of two huge bare feet, but their shape was irregular. They were disproportionately wide, with very long toes, almost like fingers, that dug deep into the sand. The heel was barely visible, and the arch of the foot seemed flat, like a board. But the strangest thing was the stride. The distance between the footprints was enormous, almost 2.5 meters, indicating the incredible height of the creature. And there was one more detail that baffled John. The footprints were asymmetrical. The left print was noticeably larger than the right, and deeper into the ground, as if the creature was limping or had some congenital deformity. He tried to find other tracks, but the chain broke off at a rocky area, disappearing into the thick undergrowth. John didn't say anything to his family so as not to scare them. In his diary, he made a quick sketch of the footprint and wrote, "Strange footprints by the river. Too big for a human. A bear? But why on 2 legs? And the shape? I've never seen anything like it. Maybe some local prank." But this entry no longer had the confidence of the morning. In the evening of the same day, as dusk began to fall, a new factor appeared, a smell. It rolled in waves carried by a light breeze from the forest. Strong, musky, with a hint of something rotten and at the same time chemical, reminiscent of the smell of wet wool and burnt wiring. It was so acrid that the children started coughing. The smell came and went, and its source was impossible to determine. When darkness fell, the family locked themselves in the camper. The mood was no longer the same. The children were acting up, and Melissa was silent, staring out the window. And then the sounds returned. This time, they were closer. It was no longer a low hum. These were distinct footsteps, heavy, irregular, as if someone huge and lame was breaking through the thicket. A step, a pause, then another step. The sound of footsteps was joined by a crackling noise, loud, dry, as if thick branches or small trees were being broken. John turned off all the lights in the camper and listened. The creature circled the perimeter of their clearing, neither approaching nor leaving. This went on for about an hour. Then everything fell silent. John's diary entry for that night was short and written in uneven, hurried handwriting. "It's here. It's walking around the camp. It's huge. The smell is unbearable. Melissa is hysterical and wants to leave right now. I told her it's dangerous to drive on a forest road at night. We decided to wait until dawn. As soon as it gets light, we're out of here. I armed myself with an axe. I don't know what it is, but it's not an animal. Or at least, not an animal I know." That was the last entry made by John Raymond's hand. No one will ever know what happened between that moment and dawn. Dawn on August 21st never came for the Raymond family. More accurately, it dawned for the rest of the world, but inside the small camper van in a forest clearing in Oregon, time stood still. The investigation that began a week later was only able to piece together a fragmentary picture of what happened next. That picture was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Melissa's sister was the first to raise the alarm when the Raymonds didn't return to Sacramento on the appointed day and didn't get in touch. Knowing John's meticulous planning, she knew something was wrong. She gave the authorities a copy of his route, and the search began. But the Syscue forest is huge, and the old logging roads are a maze with no signs. 4 more days passed before a U.S. Forest Service employee on a routine fire hazard assessment drive stumbled upon their campsite. What he saw prompted him to immediately radio the Josephine County Sheriff's Office. Later in his report, he would write that his first thought was that a gas cylinder had exploded, but the closer he got, the clearer it became that this was something else. The camper van, a 30-foot vehicle made of steel and aluminium, had been literally torn apart. It wasn't dented or smashed like in an accident. The right side of the van had been ripped out, as if a giant can opener had sliced it open from the wheel arch to the roof. The edges of the torn metal were bent outward, indicating that the force had come from outside. The roof over the living area had been torn off and thrown several meters to the side, lying in the bushes, crumpled like a sheet of paper. The door had been torn out along with the frame and lay nearby. The interior was completely destroyed. Furniture was reduced to splinters, and personal belongings were scattered all over the clearing. But that wasn't the most terrifying thing. The most terrifying thing was the almost complete absence of blood. With this level of destruction, investigators expected to see a bloodbath, but neither inside nor outside were there any significant traces of blood that would indicate serious injury or death. The team of investigators who arrived at the scene was puzzled. The initial theory of a grizzly bear attack was ruled out almost immediately. The senior investigator, a man with 20 years of experience working in forest areas, said he had never seen anything like it in his entire career. No bear, even the largest, is capable of so methodically dismantling a car. A bear could break a window, bend a door, but not tear out an entire wall and rip off the roof. An analysis of the damage showed that deep scratches remained on the metal. Still, they did not match the claws of any known North American predator. They were too broad and shallow, as if left by something blunt but powerful, like bone growths. In some places, dents resembling giant fingerprints were found on the torn metal. An inspection of the surrounding area yielded even more disturbing results. The ground around the camper was trampled. These were the same tracks that John had sketched in his diary. Now there were dozens of them. Deeply embedded in the soil, they testified to enormous weight. A trace evidence expert called to the scene spent several hours studying and measuring the prints. His conclusions, recorded in the official report, sounded like science fiction. He confirmed the asymmetry. The left foot was about 15% larger than the right. The length of the left footprint was 56 centimeters. He also noted the abnormal structure of the foot, the absence of a pronounced arch, and extremely mobile toes, which, judging by the prints, could grasp and squeeze the ground. But most importantly, based on the nature and depth of the footprints, he was able to conclude that the creature had not simply been standing or walking. It had been moving quickly, lunging forward, shifting its weight from one foot to the other. The scene around the camper was not just one of an attack, but of a fierce, deliberate assault. Deep gouges were found on the trunks of several trees at a height of 3 to 4 meters, as if the creature had clawed at the bark in a rage. A search operation was launched immediately. Dozens of volunteers and police officers combed the forest within a radius of several miles. The dogs brought to the scene behaved strangely. They whimpered, cowered at the feet of their handlers, and refused to pick up the scent from the camper, as if an insurmountable wall of smell was blocking their sense of smell. Only one dog, an experienced tracker, picked up the scent and led the group northeast, deep into the most impenetrable thicket. After about 500 meters, it found the first item, a child's sneaker belonging to Leo Raymond. Another 100 meters further on, a piece of fabric caught on the branches of a bush, a scrap of Melissa's nightgown. And that was it. The trail ended as suddenly as it had begun. The dog started to circle around, unable to pick up the scent. A thorough search of the area yielded absolutely nothing. No bodies, no other belongings, no signs of a struggle. The Raymond family had vanished. The key finding that shed light on the events leading up to the disaster was John's diary. It was found in the glove compartment of the camper, the only part of the vehicle that was almost undamaged. The entries made in the last 2 days made investigators look at the case in a new light. Descriptions of nighttime noises, sketches of footprints, mentions of an unbearable smell and growing fear. All of this transformed the picture from a simple accident into a chronicle of an encounter with the unknown. The last entry, about his intention to leave at dawn, was particularly tragic. It meant that John was aware of the danger. He had decided to act, but he didn't have enough time. The creature that had been circling their camp did not wait until morning. It attacked at night, when its victims were locked in a thin metal box, believing it to be their refuge. Investigators speculated that the initial sounds, the crackling of branches, were a tactic to intimidate. The creature studied them, tested their reactions, and then, when it was sure they were trapped, it struck. The blow was mighty, leaving them no chance. But the main question remained unanswered. Why? If it were a predator, where were the remains? If it was just a territorial display of aggression, why did it take the people with it? None of the theories explained all the facts. The monstrous strength, the absence of blood, and the disappearance of 4 people without a trace. The Raymond family case officially remained unsolved. After several months of active but fruitless searches, it was classified as a cold case. The official version, which was occasionally mentioned in comments to the local press, was deliberately vague. There was talk of unestablished circumstances and a possible attack by a wild animal. The theory of kidnapping was not seriously considered, as no ransom demand or any evidence pointed to human involvement. All physical evidence, including plaster casts of those very asymmetrical footprints, was sent to the State Forensic Laboratory, which responded with standard replies. Biological samples not identified. Origin of footprints could not be determined. Over time, the case was buried under a pile of new, more understandable crimes. However, behind the scenes of the official investigation, other things were happening. A source from the U.S. Forest Service, who spoke on condition of anonymity, said many years later that the Raymond case had caused serious concern at the federal level. A secret meeting was held with biologists, security experts, and law enforcement officials. The conclusion they reached was never intended for the general public. The Syscue forests were home to a large, unknown creature with enormous physical strength and extremely aggressive territorial behavior. It was decided not to disclose this information to avoid mass panic and economic damage to the region, which was heavily dependent on tourism and logging. The local sheriff's office was strongly advised to stop actively disseminating information about the strange details of the case. In effect, a gag order was placed on the Raymond family's story. Their tragedy was sacrificed for the sake of public peace. The forest roads in the area were not closed. Still, additional signs were posted at the entrance warning of increased bear activity, which was a cynical half-truth. It seemed that this was where the story would end. Another mystery dissolved into the wilderness of the American forests. But years later, another piece of the puzzle surfaced. It wasn't official evidence, but the story of an old lumberjack named Al Miller, who had worked in the forests of southern Oregon for over 40 years. He never went to the police because he was afraid they would think he was crazy. But after retiring, he shared his story with a local historian. This happened in 1989, 4 years before the Raymonds disappeared, and only 30 miles from where they had set up their last camp. Al worked in logging, and one autumn he went out alone to check on a remote logging site. He was deep in the forest, several hours' walk from the nearest road. As he approached, he smelled the same odor that John Raymond would later describe in his diary, a pungent mixture of wet dog, rot, and something chemical. Then he heard a crackling sound. Thinking it was a bear, he climbed onto a large boulder to look around. What he saw in a small clearing below made him freeze. There was a creature. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, but it looked dried out and sickly. It stood on 2 legs, but its body was misshapen. Its right shoulder was noticeably lower than its left, and its right arm seemed shorter and thinner. It moved by leaning on its left leg, the one that, judging by the footprints, left the larger footprint. Its fur grew in tufts, revealing patches of dark, rough tan skin, covered with scars and growths. The creature didn't notice Al. It was busy with the deer's carcass, and the way it was dealing with it was the most shocking thing. It didn't use claws or teeth. It just tore the flesh and broke the bones with its bare hands, with a force Al couldn't imagine. The movements were sharp, furious, and incredibly effective. From time to time, it made quiet, clicking sounds, and a low, throaty growl that, according to Al, was felt more by his body than his ears. Al sat on his boulder for almost an hour, not daring to move, until the creature had had its fill and dragged the remains of the carcass into the thicket. Al Miller left and never returned to that area. He realized that there was a master in those woods, and he didn't want to meet him again. Al Miller's story, while not direct evidence, nevertheless fits perfectly with all the facts of the Raymond case. An asymmetrical, limping creature leaving uneven tracks, incredible physical strength, capable of tearing steel as easily as flesh, a distinctive smell and sounds. Everything fits. It is likely that the Raymond family, without knowing it, had invaded the territory of this creature. Their camper, generator, the smells of food, and children's laughter. All of this was perceived as a challenge. The attack was not an act of predation. It was a total cleansing of the territory, the destruction of a foreign object, the camper, and the elimination of the irritant, the family. Where it took the bodies to a cave, a swamp, or hid them in the thicket, we will never know. Today, the case of the disappearance of John, Melissa, Leo, and Chloe Raymond is covered in dust in the Josephine County archives. To the official justice system, they remain missing, but for those familiar with the details of this story, their fate is a terrifying reminder that even in the 21st century, there are places on our planet where humans are not at the top of the food chain, and that humanity's oldest nightmares sometimes take on flesh and blood, continuing to live in the wildest and most forgotten corners of our world, patiently waiting for the next unwary visitor.